Hi, my name is Joy Morgan, 33 years old. That day, I sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Denver, filled with hope but also a touch of tension. I thought today would be the day justice finally smiled at me. After years of carrying family responsibilities, paying hospital bills, and sending thousands of dollars to help my parents, I believed I would at least be granted a share of the estate. But when the lawyer spoke, the world around me seemed to freeze. He read each word clearly. The entire house in Aurora, the investment accounts, the life insurance policy, all of it, was left to Elysia. I, the eldest daughter, was mentioned in the will only for a few old keepsakes. I went numb, my heart squeezed tight. Without a word, I took out my phone and canceled every auto transfer right there at the lawyer's desk. A week later, my mother sent a short message, "Mortgage is due." I stared at the screen, my hand trembling, and replied, "Not mine home." Even now, as I write these lines, I wonder how many people out there have been treated like a walking wallet by their own family. Where are you following my story from, and what time is it where you are? I truly want to know, so I don't feel so alone on this journey. My childhood began in a quiet neighborhood in Aurora, Colorado. The two-story house with its white-painted wooden fence and small front garden was always my mother's pride. My father, David, was an insurance engineer, a calm man but strict about finances. My mother, Daria, was an elementary school teacher, devoted to her work and often bringing home stacks of unfinished papers to grade. Our family was middle class, not wealthy, but comfortable enough for my mother to buy us new books at the start of each school year, and for my father to occasionally take us out to eat on holidays. I was the child who always loved school. From an early age, I was fascinated by numbers, by cubes, and I could spend hours at my little desk solving tough math problems or sketching floor plans of imaginary houses. I remember when I was only 8, I cut up cardboard to build a model house and carefully colored in every single window. My father looked at it, nodded, and said, "You've got a knack for engineering, just like me." But that spark in his eyes lasted only a moment, quickly shifting to Elysia as she twirled her dress and danced a few clumsy steps, making both my parents burst into laughter. Elysia was 6 years younger than me, the baby of the family. She was born with a dazzling smile and eyes that knew how to capture attention. While I devoted myself to my studies, Elysia was encouraged to join every kind of extracurricular activity, dance, drama, musical theater, even art classes. She was lively, outspoken, able to light up an entire room with just a funny story. Meanwhile, when I brought home a test filled with straight A's, the most I'd get was a nod. "Good. You've always been smart anyway." The favoritism in our home became so normal that I didn't even know what to call it when I was little. But I remember vividly one summer evening, right after I finished my senior year of high school. I had been named valedictorian, standing in front of hundreds of students and parents to deliver the graduation speech. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. Yet when the ceremony ended, my family simply took me to a small Italian restaurant, ordered a few plates of plain pasta, and went home. I didn't dare say anything, I just told myself not to expect too much. 3 years later, Elysia won first place in a statewide dance competition. Immediately, my parents threw a grand backyard party, set up a tent, hired a live band, and invited nearly the whole neighborhood to celebrate. I had just graduated from college that same season, but the event turned into a tribute to Elysia. All eyes were on her, twirling in a shimmering dress under the lights, while I sat forgotten at a plastic table, forcing a smile at a few neighbors. That feeling of imbalance was like a small blade, sinking deeper with each passing year. I still remember one afternoon when I was about 16. I had just won an award at the state's Young Science Design competition, bringing home a certificate and a check for $1,000. Excited, I rushed to show my father, thinking this time he would be genuinely proud. But instead of hugging me, he only gave a faint smile and said, "Joy, you're already strong enough. Elysia is the one who needs support." That sentence dropped into me like a stone. From that day forward, I understood that in my parents' eyes, my achievements were never a surprise, never something that needed praise or investment. It was Alicia, the ever-fragile little sister, who would always be the center of their attention. That favoritism showed up even in the smallest things. When I asked to enroll in an advanced math class, my mother said the tuition was too expensive and probably unnecessary since I was already good. But when it came to Alicia wanting ballet lessons with the most renowned teacher in town, they didn't hesitate to write the check and even drove her to practice every evening. I got used to buying my own reference books from secondhand stores, while Alicia always had new dresses for birthday parties. Looking back, I don't believe my parents hated me. I truly think they loved both of us, but their love was distributed unevenly. With me, they loved through faith, trusting that I would always take care of myself. With Alicia, they loved through action, shielding her, providing for her, protecting her from every stumble. But that very difference planted in me a hollow feeling, as if I had to carry life entirely on my own without being able to rely on anyone. I gradually became the introverted child, always buried in books, while Alicia was the center of every family gathering. Whenever relatives came over, she was called out to dance or sing, while I was only mentioned if someone asked, "So how's Joy doing in school?" I would force a smile, hold up my straighter report card, and receive nothing more than a vague pat on the shoulder. Night after night, I studied quietly under the glow of my desk lamp, listening to the laughter of my parents and Alicia drifting in from the living room. I knew I wasn't a bad child, but I also understood that in that house, there was an invisible gap I could never fill. And my father's words, "You're already strong enough, Alicia is the one who needs help," became a constant reminder. I wasn't allowed to be weak, wasn't allowed to need anyone, because all the protection in our home had been reserved for my sister. By the time I turned 18, I left Aurora to study architecture and construction at the University of Colorado in Boulder. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that felt both thrilling and daunting. I knew my parents couldn't cover all the expenses, and honestly, I didn't expect them to. I had grown used to handling things on my own, used to those words, "You're strong enough." So I nodded and accepted a partial scholarship, added student loans, and filled the rest with part-time jobs that I would have to manage myself. In those first days living in the dorms, I attended every class while juggling shifts as a barista at a cafe near campus, where the morning shift started at 5 a.m. In the evenings, I tutored high school students in math around the area. Some nights, I would finish work close to midnight, only to sit back down at my drafting table to complete unfinished designs. My body was exhausted, but in my heart burned a fire. I would build a future that no one could ever deny. While I scraped together every dollar to buy used textbooks on Amazon, Alicia, when it was her turn for college, was sent to a prestigious private university in California. I still remember the day the whole family took her to Los Angeles International Airport. My parents hugged her with tears in their eyes and even paid extra for overweight luggage, while I had once driven my own little moving truck to my dorm with no one there to see me off. Her tuition, dorm fees, and living expenses were all covered by our parents. They simply said, "This is an opportunity for Alicia to develop her artistic talent. You already have scholarships, you can take care of yourself." Many nights behind the cafe counter, I would scroll through Instagram. Alicia's images filled my feed: Malibu beaches, neon-lit parties, luxurious getaways with her friends. She beamed, cocktail in hand, captioning photos with words brimming with freedom. Meanwhile, I smelled of coffee grounds, my fingers cracked from washing mugs, with a long list of assignments waiting for me. The contrast grew sharper with each passing year. I was laying bricks for my future with sweat and perseverance, while Alicia seemed to glide effortlessly along a path strewn with roses. But those roses didn't appear on their own. My parents had trimmed them out of my labor, out of funds that could have eased the burden for both of us, and funneled everything into her. I began to realize that love in our house had never been divided equally, and that truth grew inside me like a widening shadow. I remember one winter break when I went home. I brought back a design drawing that my professor had praised highly, hoping my parents would feel proud. But when I spread it out on the dining table, my mother only glanced at it before turning to discuss Alicia's summer plans in Italy. "You'll be attending an international fashion workshop. We've already paid for it." I sat there, biting my lip to swallow the feeling of being left out, then quietly folded the drawing back up. During all that time, I held on to my pride. I didn't want to seem jealous, and I didn't want to argue. I kept telling myself that my success would speak for itself one day. But the truth was, in that house, unfairness had become a habit, and the love shown to me always came with a condition. "You can take care of yourself." Those words were a sweet-sounding dismissal, as if my strength meant I didn't deserve care. Gradually, I stopped expecting praise or recognition. I built a shell with smiles and the same old lines, "I'm fine." But inside, I knew family love is not something that can be rationed or sold, yet in the Morgan house it was handed out selectively. And I was always the one standing outside. Those college years became a turning point. I realized I couldn't keep living, hoping to be treated fairly. If I wanted a life with value, I had to create it myself from nothing, no matter how much of my parents' love and money had been poured onto Alicia's shoulders. From then on, I understood that every step forward for me was not only about education or career, it was a quiet battle against the favoritism that had seeped into every corner of my family. After graduation, I began working for a major architecture firm in Denver. In those early days, I was swept into a whirlwind of projects, deadlines, and thick stacks of design drafts. I learned from those ahead of me, worked overtime without being asked, and gradually became one of the firm's most highly regarded employees. But deep down, I knew I didn't want to remain just another small name on a company roster. I wanted to build something of my own, a firm that carried my personal mark, where I could merge my passion for architecture with my dream of sustainable development. So, after 3 years of saving, I gathered every dollar I had, added a bank loan, and launched EcoVision Design, a small firm specializing in green, energy-efficient projects. At the time, everyone said I was reckless. A young woman, with no family backing, daring to start a company in a city as competitive as Denver? But I had nothing to lose. I threw myself into the work, logging 80-hour weeks, eating instant noodles, and sleeping on a couch in my rented office. I was the director, the accountant, and the errand runner all at once. There were nights when I collapsed asleep at my drafting table, the harsh neon light pouring down on dark circles under my eyes. And yet, I felt alive because every drop of sweat was proof of a future I was building with my own hands. While I was struggling to build my career, Alicia continued finding herself through a string of failed jobs. Sometimes she worked as a PR assistant, other times she tried online sales, but none of those jobs lasted more than a few months. She would often call our mother in tears, complaining that the environment wasn't right, that people didn't understand her talent. And as always, my parents comforted her, blamed the circumstances, and never once held her accountable. Then one day, Alicia announced that she wanted to open a fashion boutique in downtown Denver. My parents immediately funded her without a second thought about the risks. I began to hear from a friend who lived near Aurora that Alicia's boutique was lavishly decorated. She had rented a prime location downtown, displayed expensive dresses, and even hired a professional photographer to shoot her collection. Alicia posted photos online, flaunting her new car with the caption, "Grand opening went well, treating myself to a little gift." I stared at that photo, filled with suspicion. Where did the capital for that boutique come from? She had failed at several jobs in a row, and my parents didn't exactly have that much spare money. Even then, I didn't argue or accuse. I returned to my office and buried myself in the next project. I had grown used to relying only on myself. I believed the only real justice in this life was persistence. Those who truly worked would eventually reap the rewards. When my father suddenly suffered a heart attack and had to be rushed to the hospital, I was in the middle of negotiating a major contract with a client. I had been saving up to buy new equipment for my company, but every cent of that $28,000 I transferred straight to the hospital. I signed the check in silence, without hesitation. I told myself, this is my duty. This is what a child must do. I postponed the equipment purchase, delayed company plans, and accepted more sleepless nights to make up for it. I didn't compare myself to Alicia, didn't ask if she contributed a single dollar, because I already knew the answer. Sometime later, one evening when I stopped by for a visit, my father suddenly sighed and quietly said to me in the kitchen, "Sweetheart, I tried investing in a real estate project, but it failed. To pay off the debt, your mother and I had to remortgage the Aurora house. I know you've already helped so much, but if you could send money regularly each month to help with the mortgage and taxes, we'll get through this." I froze, but then nodded. I thought simply, anyone can make mistakes in investments, and my father had worked hard his whole life. Now it was my turn to share the burden. Every month, like clockwork, I opened the banking app on my phone, typed in the number $2,400, and pressed transfer. In the memo line, I always wrote the same familiar words: mortgage divided by taxes. That was the unspoken agreement between my mother and me. I would help them pay the property taxes and the mortgage, contributing to the upkeep of the house where I grew up. At first, I even felt proud that I was capable of doing that. Many of my peers were still struggling with student loan debt, yet I was able to both support my family and build my company. I told myself it was proof that I really was strong enough, just like my father always said. But little by little, the reasons my mother gave for needing extra funds began to make me uneasy. One month, she said, "Property taxes went up this year, you'll need to send more." Another month, she sighed, "The roof needs repairs, it's expensive. Please help your father and me cover it." I believed her, because I had never doubted my parents before. So I sent more, quietly tightened my own budget, cut out weekend coffee outings with friends, and even once delayed bonuses for my employees just to make sure I sent the money on time. I always repeated to myself, a daughter must sacrifice for her parents. It's her duty, and she must never complain. There were nights when, after completing the transfer, I just sat frozen in front of my computer screen. I felt like a puppet, or more accurately, a walking ATM. My parents only had to press the PIN code with a few words of complaint, and I would gut myself to send them money. I was angry and bitter all at once. For years, I had been working 80-hour weeks, eating and sleeping at the office, only for the money I earned to flow straight into Alicia's dream, a dream she had never paid a price for. There were nights when I sat alone in the EcoVision design office, staring at unsigned contracts, my heart full of resentment. I wanted to scream, "Where is the fairness? Where is the love?" But I kept it in. I didn't allow myself to be weak. Instead, I told myself, "All right, just consider this your duty. A daughter must sacrifice for her parents." That sentence became a familiar refrain in my mind, like a sedative that kept me from facing the too cruel truth. I knew I was being taken advantage of, but I was afraid to admit it. Because once I said it out loud, the already fragile relationship with my parents would completely shatter. So I kept sending the money, kept playing the role of the strong daughter, while deep inside, I had already begun to crack. I didn't realize that every click of transfer was not only draining my bank account but also eroding the trust I had in my own family. The day I was invited to the lawyer's office in downtown Denver, the autumn air outside was crisp, but inside me burned a fierce heat. I thought, at the very least, this would be the moment my parents treated both daughters fairly, after all the years I had carried the weight. I reassured myself, maybe they weren't good at expressing love, but surely they wouldn't abandon me when it came to dividing the estate. The conference room was small, with a long polished wooden table, and on it lay a thick stack of papers. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began reading line by line. The house in Aurora, valued at approximately $700,000, is left entirely to Alicia Morgan. My heart clenched, but I stayed silent, waiting to hear more. The investment accounts, valued at $200,000, also go to Alicia Morgan. The life insurance policy, valued at $250,000, likewise passes to Elysia Morgan. Each figure struck like the blow of a gavel, pounding against my head until my ears rang. I sat frozen, my hands clenched so tightly that my nails dug deep into my skin. Then the lawyer paused, glancing at me with a look of pity. "The remainder, Joy Morgan will receive. Your grandmother's old sewing machine, along with some family photographs." His voice softened, as if even he could not ignore the blatant unfairness. I nodded slightly, forcing down the tears that threatened to rise. For a fleeting moment, I felt like a background character in my own family story, handed a few lifeless keepsakes as my so-called share. I turned to look at my father. He sat upright, his face calm, as though everything had been decided long ago. My throat tightened as I asked, "And what about me? After all these years, after everything I've contributed, after standing by the family through every hardship, why do I only get some photos and an old sewing machine?" My father answered in a low, firm voice. "Joy, you already have a solid company. You don't need these things. Elysia is the one who needs help." It was the same line that had haunted me since childhood, repeated once more this time like a knife twisting into a wound that had never healed. I let out a laugh, but it was bitter. "And what about all the money I've been sending for years? $2,400 every month, plus hospital bills, plus home repairs, all of it came from my sweat. In the end, I paid for a house I will never inherit." The room fell into silence, broken only by the lawyer's pen tapping rhythmically against the table. My mother lowered her head, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress, while Elysia avoided my gaze, her eyes brimming with tears yet still saying nothing. I stood up, gathering my bag, each movement heavy as if I were dragging a lifetime of disappointment. I didn't wait for explanations or excuses. I knew that any words now would only be justifications for the favoritism that had been cultivated for years. As I stepped out of that room, I pulled out my phone, opened the banking app, and blocked every auto transfer I had set up. One by one, I deleted the payments, erasing each transaction as if cutting away the invisible chains binding me to the Aurora house. When the door of the lawyer's office closed behind me, I felt something inside me collapse, but at the same time, I felt freed. I was no longer a walking ATM. From that moment on, I knew I would pay the price of distance, perhaps even a lifetime of coldness from my parents. But I also knew I had just reclaimed a piece of freedom that had long been drained away. And, deep in my heart, one aching question echoed: had my parents ever truly seen me not as the one, strong enough to carry the burden, but simply as a daughter who longed to be loved? That night, when I returned to my small apartment in Denver, I sat silently on the sofa, staring at my phone screen still showing the confirmations of the canceled auto transfers. My heart felt both heavy and hollow, as if a part of my body had just been drained of blood. I knew I needed to face the truth, not just rely on the feeling of betrayal but back it with numbers, with clear evidence. So I called Michael, my financial advisor and CPA who had been with me since the early days of founding Ecovision Design. He was meticulous, exacting with every figure, and most importantly, he never let me deceive myself. We met in his office the next morning. On the table was a stack of bank statements I had carefully printed out over the years. Michael pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, flipped through each page, and tapped his pen against his notebook. "Joy, we need to make a detailed breakdown. Every payment, every month, nothing left out." I nodded, opened my laptop, my hands trembling slightly but determined not to let emotion take over. For hours we sat there logging everything. The recurring transfers of $2,400 each month, the checks for hospital bills when my father had surgery, even the extra thousands I sent whenever my mother said the roof was leaking or the heating system needed repairs. The total left me breathless. Over $180,000 in 5 years. I stared at the final figure on the Excel screen, my heart pounding as if it might burst. 180,000, this wasn't just money. It was my sleepless nights, the times I held off buying new equipment for my company, the vacations I canceled to save. It was my youth drained dry for a house I would never inherit. Michael looked up, his eyes sharp. Joy, did you ever check where that money actually went? I hesitated, then shook my head. I had always trusted my parents, trusted that the money was used exactly as they said. Michael stayed silent for a moment, then opened his laptop and pulled up the transaction data I had given him. His fingers moved quickly across the trackpad before he stopped, turning the screen toward me. There it was, plain as day transfers from my parents' account into an account under the name Elijah Morgan, almost immediately after my payments. Sometimes within a few days, sometimes within just hours. I sat in shock. Every dollar I had sent to help my parents had been funneled straight into supporting my sister's boutique. The complaints about taxes, about a leaking roof, about maintenance costs, all of it had been excuses. The naked truth stared me in the face. I hadn't just been turned into a walking wallet. I had been used to bankroll Elysia's glittering dream, a dream she never had to pay for. A dry, brittle laugh escaped me, echoing through the small office. Michael watched with concern, but I only shook my head as tears spilled uncontrollably. So it turns out, I choked, all this time, I've been funding her boutique. I was the one behind those sparkling dresses, the grand opening parties, the luxury travel photos she posted online. I remembered all the times I told myself I was the dutiful daughter, helping my parents shoulder their burdens. But in reality, I had only been the invisible sponsor for my sister, the one who already had every ounce of their favoritism. Michael placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice steady. Joy, this isn't your fault. You acted out of trust and responsibility. The fault lies with those who took advantage of that love. I nodded, though my heart was in turmoil. It took me a long time before I could draw a deep breath and force myself to look at the spreadsheet again. Each number was no longer just a dry symbol, but a testimony to the truth. The love in my family had long been reduced to a one-sided transaction, with me as the only one paying the price. Leaving Michael's office that day, I felt both pain and relief. Pain, because I had to face such a harsh truth. Relief, because at last I knew exactly where I stood in this game of favoritism. And for the first time in years, I whispered to myself, enough. From now on, not another dollar. Alright. 1 week after canceling the auto transfers, my phone buzzed with a short message from my mother. The screen lit up in the middle of a busy morning at the Ecovision design office. Mortgage is due. I stared at the words for a long time, as if they were nothing more than a harmless joke. But then I realized no, she truly expected me to keep playing the same old role, the walking ATM. I set the phone down on my desk, took a long breath, and typed my reply. Not mine home. For the first time in my life, I offered no excuses, no detours, no apologies. Just 4 short, resolute words. Less than an hour later, my father called. His voice came hard and sharp through the phone. You're ungrateful, Joy. All these years your mother and I raised you, gave you food, sent you to school, and now you turn your back. Do you know how much your mother cries? You're breaking her heart. As I listened, a flood of emotions rose in me. The old guilt surfaced again, like a reflex planted in me since childhood, the reflex that I was always at fault whenever I failed to meet their expectations. But this time, I did not collapse. I answered calmly, I'm not ungrateful. I'm simply done letting myself be used. My father roared, but I pressed the end call button. My hand trembled slightly, but my heart stayed steady. The next day, I discovered my parents had called my company's office, trying to speak with several of my colleagues. They implied that I was mentally unstable, that I was under severe stress, unable to manage my finances. A close coworker pulled me aside to tell me, awkwardly, what they had said. I stayed silent, but inside me a surge of anger flared. My parents, the very people who should have protected their daughter, had chosen to smear me to apply pressure, simply because I had stopped pouring money into their pockets. Meanwhile, Elysia began posting cryptic statuses on social media. Some people just can't stand seeing others succeed. Or, envy is a poison that eats away at the soul. Beneath her words was a photo of her in a new dress, standing before the brightly lit boutique, smiling radiantly. Outsiders probably thought she was responding to some invisible enemy, but I knew every word was aimed squarely at me. I read them, my heart stinging, and then gave a small, quiet laugh. In the past, I might have texted her to confront her or agonized over being cast as some ugly shadow in her narrative. But now I understood, this was nothing but emotional manipulation, gaslighting, the same tactic my family had used on me all my life. They wanted me to believe I was wrong. They wanted me to think I was selfish, ungrateful, jealous. But for the first time, I looked straight at the truth. I was not wrong. I was simply protecting myself. And I had drawn a boundary clear, firm, and non-negotiable. I typed into the family group chat. From now on, no one is allowed to mention money to me. If it continues, I will block all contact. The moment I hit send, I felt an unfamiliar sense of relief. As if, after years of endurance, I had finally found my voice. My parents might call me an unfilial daughter, Elysia might continue dropping hints online, but I knew I was no longer a prisoner in their emotional game. My silence was no longer the silence of submission, it was the silence of someone who had chosen to stand firm, never again allowing anyone to cross that line. In the weeks after I set that boundary, the Aurora house that had always glowed with lights in the evenings grew dim. I no longer kept track directly, but word reached me quickly. The bank issued foreclosure warnings after my parents missed 2 consecutive mortgage payments. The house they had once proudly called the Morgan home now stood on the brink of repossession. I pictured my father clutching the notice in his hands, his face flushed with anger, while my mother sat stunned on the sofa, her trembling hands clasped together. They had grown used to me as their human insurance policy, used to the idea that one short message would automatically bring money flowing in. Not anymore. I was no longer their walking wallet. Meanwhile, Elysia's fashion boutique began to falter. At first, there were a few customer complaints about product quality, then one-star reviews started piling up online. Orders slowed, while rent and staff costs continued to climb. I heard she had been forced to shut down her online sales branch, keeping only the main store. But credit card debt didn't stop. Instead of the sparkling photos of new dresses, Elysia now posted blurry images with short captions, trying to appear cheerful. I knew well that it was only a facade. One weekend afternoon, Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister, called me. Her voice was heavy. "Joy, I've heard everything. You don't need to hide it anymore. Elysia has been bragging to her friends that the boutique money came from your parents, and your parents took it from you. Now it's all out in the open." I stayed silent for a long while. Deep down, I had known this day would come, but hearing it confirmed by someone else still felt like a blade pressing into an old wound. Aunt Linda sighed. "This family has treated you far too unfairly. I am truly ashamed of my sister." The news spread quickly through the relatives. Conversations at family gatherings began to change in tone. If once I had been that cold, quiet Joy, now people whispered about my sacrifices, about how I had been turned into an unwilling source of funding for my sister. Pitying looks gradually replaced indifferent ones. More importantly, the criticism began to shift toward my parents. "David and Daria have played favorites for too long. I can't believe they exploited their own daughter." Those words reached my ears like gusts of wind, cold and cutting, because I never wanted my family to be the subject of gossip, but warm because, finally, the truth was being seen by others, not just me. My grandfather Frank was the only one in the family who had always been blunt with me. A former lawyer, he was used to cutting through the core of disputes, and he despised deceit more than anything. When Aunt Linda told him what had happened, he didn't hesitate. "We're all going to sit down," he said firmly in a short call. "No more avoidance, no more rumors, everything must be brought into the open." A week later, he invited the entire family to his red brick house in Denver for a special dinner. I arrived early, carrying a thick folder in my hand. On the long dining table, my grandfather had already laid out the old porcelain dishes he only used for important occasions. The atmosphere was taut, stretched thin like a wire. When my parents and Elysia walked in, I could see the unease in their eyes. My father's gaze darted around the room, my mother clutched her handbag tightly, and Elysia kept her head down, her blonde hair falling across half her face. Grandfather wasted no time on pleasantries. He tapped a spoon against his glass, his voice sharp and commanding. "We are here to speak the truth, no more hiding. Joy, you begin." I opened the folder, my hand trembling slightly, but my voice steady. Page after page of bank statements was spread across the table. The regular $2,400 transfers each month, the checks for hospital bills, and the transactions that flowed into Elysia's account just hours after I sent the money. In the last 5 years, I've paid over $180,000, I said, looking straight at my parents. Here is the evidence. This isn't something I made up. My father shot to his feet, his face flushed red. "You don't understand. It was only temporary. We always planned to pay you back." My mother quickly added, her voice shaking. "You earn so much money. We just wanted to give Elysia a chance to start." I held back my anger and pushed the papers toward them. "You can deny my feelings, but you cannot deny these numbers. This is the truth." The air grew heavy. Grandfather Frank fixed his gaze on his son, his eyes cold. "David, Daria, you turned your eldest daughter into a bottomless wallet. She is not a bank. She is your child." His words rang through the room, leaving my parents speechless. My mother wiped at her tears, while my father lowered his head in silence. Then suddenly, Elysia lifted her head. Her eyes brimmed with tears, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Joy. I never thought. I only did what Mom and Dad told me. I never had to learn how to stand on my own. I've been weak, and I know I've leaned on you far too much." Tears streamed down her cheeks, and for the first time, I didn't see pride or carefree charm in her, but a lost young woman. I drew a deep breath, then answered softly. "Elysia, you don't owe me an apology. You owe it to yourself. You need to learn how to walk on your own, instead of letting Mom, Dad, and me shield you forever." The room fell into silence, broken only by the faint clink of a spoon against a wineglass. Elysia nodded, her small shoulders trembling, but in her eyes I caught a flicker I had never seen before, the spark of awakening. That dinner held no laughter, no warmth of a family reunited. But it held the truth. And truth, however painful, was better than the sweet lies that had cloaked the Morgan household for so many years. As I left, I felt a vast emptiness inside me, but into that emptiness, a new air began to flow, the fresh air of release. I knew that after that night, my family would never be the same again. But at least, for the first time, everyone had faced the truth. After the tense dinner at Grandfather Frank's house, my family walked out of that room with heavy faces. No one could deny the truth any longer. The numbers, the statements, the evidence I laid on the table had shattered the wall of excuses my parents had tried so hard to build. Their silence that night was their admission. But facing the truth was only the first step. The price still remained, and this time they could no longer shift it onto my shoulders. Just 1 month later, my parents were forced to sell the Aurora house. The bank had issued its final warning, and there was no more money for me to cover the gaps. The house I once called home, the place that held memories of an unfair childhood and quiet sorrow, was finally sold for nearly $700,000. From that sum, they paid off the HELOC of more than $310,000, along with a mountain of other debts. What remained wasn't much, just enough to buy a small apartment in Lakewood, far more modest than Aurora. I heard the news from Aunt Linda. Inside me rose a swirl of emotions. Pain, regret, but also relief. It was an ending that couldn't be avoided, the direct consequence of wrong choices, and this time, I wasn't there to rescue them. Elysia didn't escape the storm either. The fashion boutique my parents had poured so much money and energy into was finally forced to shut down. Credit card debt piled up, customers dwindled, and there was no more invisible funding from me to prop it up. I heard she cried through many nights, facing for the first time the reality that life could not be sustained by the glitter of social media. After that shock, Alicia decided to enroll in a business management course at a community college near Denver, while also taking a part-time job at a small cafe. It was humble work, but at least it was honest labor. When I heard this, I didn't feel triumphant, nor did I mock her. I only exhaled softly and whispered, "At last, you've begun." Then, one winter afternoon, I received an envelope delivered to my office. The handwriting on it was shaky, yet so familiar it made my heart clench. It was from my father. I sat alone in my office as the sunset cast golden light through the window, my hand gently opening the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, his script carefully drawn, smudged in places by tears. "Joy." The letter began. "I was wrong. I made you carry far too much, when it was my duty to protect you. I thought you were strong enough and turned that belief into an excuse to exploit your strength. I have no defense left. If you cannot forgive me yet, I accept that. But I want you to know that I truly regret what I've done." I read those lines over and over, my vision blurring. This was the first time my father had ever admitted his mistakes, no excuses, no blaming anyone else. Inside me rose a strange feeling, not instant forgiveness, but a slow thawing of the ice wall I had built for so many years. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in my desk drawer, and sat in silence for a long time. A few weeks later, I agreed to meet my parents at a small diner in Lakewood. No more grand house, no more elaborate dinners. Just a simple round table, 3 people sitting across from each other. My father looked much older, his hair graying rapidly, while my mother was quieter, her eyes red-rimmed. I set my bag on the table and spoke before they could. I agreed to meet, but from now on everything must be clear. No money, only family, if there's any left. If you want to keep contact with me, do it with truth, with affection, not with demands. My parents nodded silently. There were no flowery promises, no staged scenes of remorse. Only acceptance. And for me, that was enough. For the first time, I no longer felt like the one who had to pay for every mistake in the family. I had drawn my boundary clearly, and my parents understood that, if they crossed it, I would not come back. As I left the diner that day, I drew a deep breath in the cold Colorado winter air. My heart still carried its scars, but at least it now beat to the rhythm of freedom. And I knew the condition of my reconciliation was set simple but firm: affection was welcome, money would never be again. After the stormy years, I began rebuilding a new life for myself, a life no longer revolving around saving anyone else, no more desperate phone calls of mortgages due. I used a portion of the savings from my company to buy a small house nestled near the base of the Rocky Mountains. It was a light gray wooden home with a sloping roof and a backyard large enough for me to plant a few rows of flowers and some vegetables. In the mornings, I woke early, brewed a cup of coffee, and walked barefoot on the grass, breathing in the fresh air. I realized I had never truly lived for myself until I dared to cut the cords that tied me to the past. Each week, I set aside time for therapy. My therapist, Maria, patiently listened to the stories I had never spoken aloud before, the feeling of abandonment, the years of being a walking ATM, and the anger I had buried deep inside. At first, I struggled to find the words, but gradually, I learned to acknowledge that I had the right to hurt, the right to be angry, the right to be vulnerable. I didn't need to shoulder the weight of being strong all the time. That therapy didn't turn me into someone else, but it taught me how to set boundaries, how to say no without guilt. While I was healing on the inside, Ecovision Design also grew steadily. We signed contracts to design green buildings for schools and community centers. I no longer worked 80 hours a week like before. I learned how to delegate, how to trust my team, and more importantly, how to give myself rest. Some afternoons, I closed my laptop early to tend to the lavender in my garden, or walked with Ethan around the small lake at the foot of the mountains. I realized that true success wasn't measured by hours worked, but by living a life of balance and wholeness. Ethan, the architect boyfriend who had stood by me throughout this journey, became my steady anchor. We began to talk about the future together, even about marriage. He didn't see me as a woman, strong enough to handle everything alone, but as a whole human being, sometimes strong, sometimes fragile, and always worthy of love. On quiet evenings, sitting together on the porch, Ethan would hold my hand and whisper, "Joy, you don't have to prove anything anymore. You deserve this happiness." I still saw my parents from time to time. We would meet at a small cafe in Lakewood, talk about health, about the weather, sometimes share small stories. But one thing never changed. No one ever mentioned money again. I had drawn that boundary, and my parents, after everything, had learned to respect it. Though the distance remained, I chose to keep a fragile thread of connection. But that thread no longer chained me. As for Elysia, my younger sister, she had changed too. She no longer posted showy photos online. Instead, I began to see her sharing snapshots from her part-time shifts with captions like, "Morning shift, tired but happy." One night, I unexpectedly received a message from her. "Because you cut off the money, I've finally learned to live for myself. I know you don't have to support me anymore, and I'm grateful for that." Reading her words, a strange mix of emotions rose in me: relief, sadness, and hope all at once. Perhaps, for the first time in her life, Elysia was truly growing up. Looking back, I understood that the phrase, "not mine home," wasn't just a refusal to pay for a debt-ridden house. It was a clear declaration. I was rejecting the toxic home so that I could build my own. I was no longer a walking wallet, no longer the forgotten child, no longer carrying a responsibility I didn't create. I was Joy Morgan, a woman who had redefined her worth not through a will, not through her parents' recognition, but through freedom and choice. One quiet weekend evening, after finishing up at the Ecovision office, I locked the door. The hallway was silent, filled only with the wind blowing down from the Rockies. I stood there, letting the cold brush against my cheeks, my hair lifted lightly. In that moment, I whispered, "I am no longer a walking wallet. I am Joy Morgan. And I have found my true worth."